The streetcar line along St. Clair West has long been a defining part of the avenue's landscape, identity, and history over a century. It's a key part of the infrastructure of this area. Little surprise then that opinions were quite strong and even divided about the installation of a streetcar right-of-way that was completed in 2009-2010. With this recent history in mind, I want to talk about a relatively unknown fact. This was not the first time that St. Clair had a right-of-way for streetcars. During the 1910s and 1920s, the avenue was home to a streetcar right-of-way, or boulevard, or reservation, as it was commonly called, until the city gradually removed it during the late 1920s and early 1930s. So I want to examine why the boulevard was built in the first place, why it was then removed, and what these decisions say about changing ideas and pressures related to pedestrian safety, cars, and city building during these decades. My hope is that this will help us contextualize more recent decisions to reinstall the right-of-way and associated streetscape improvements, as the often competing pressures of pedestrian safety and automobility are certainly still with us today. But first, a general historical overview of St. Clair before the streetcar. In part, I'm the privilege of being the first speaker of the symposium, so just to kind of provide an even wider context of understanding St. Clair. So what became known as St. Clair Avenue was laid out as the third concession road by the British around the turn of the 19th century, Queen and Bloor being the first two concession roads from the lake. Initial settlement around St. Clair in the late 18th and 19th century featured the homes of the wealthy, probably most prominent being the Baldwins, who built their estate above the escarpment right across from what's now Casa Loma. Until the early 20th century, Davenport Road was actually the major thoroughfare in the area. For example, an electric streetcar was built there first in 1892. Again, just work with us on the PowerPoint here, but this is a 1893 bird's eye map of Toronto. And there is Davenport Road along here. And this is St. Clair. And you can really see, or I hope you can see, the greenery around here. Obviously, there was always some artistic liberty taken with these bird's eye maps, but again, illustrating the rural character of this area in the turn of the century. And with Davenport, here's Bloor, settlement, sort of creeping around there, and that Davenport was more of a major thoroughfare. And one of the reasons for this impediment for settlement on St. Clair, along with many other factors, was the Lake Iroquois shoreline, or the hill as they call it. You can notice it when you're going up Bathurst Street, the elevation there. During this era, St. Clair Avenue was so little used as a thoroughfare that the actual road became apparently home to Saturday night dancing parties. One resident reflecting on these parties said they were quite undisturbed by any traffic, and should a vehicle perchance present itself, they, the party attendees, would all gasp in amazement. So unlike Davenport, St. Clair West was a relatively unused thoroughfare in the 19th century. Now, the speed of development quickened along much of St. Clair in the 1910s and 1920s, especially with a series of annexations by the city that took place of various communities along and near St. Clair West from 1909 and 1911. But much of St. Clair was still quite rural at the time of these annexations. Around this time, a number of impetuses for development existed, and I know Richard Harris is going to talk a little bit more about this in the next panel. And this includes the growth of industrial facilities, so for example the stockyards around Kiel, and also general migration and population growth in the city. And the building of a streetcar line along St. Clair also spurred growth in the area, although these maps here show in tandem the momentum of development was already headed St. Clair's way before the streetcar. So just to explain, these are a series of stitched-together fire insurance maps from 1910 and 1924. Here is St. Clair Avenue, and here is St. Clair Avenue. And the fire insurance maps, actually, compared to the bird's eye maps, are actually a lot more accurate. And you can certainly see, the sort of a lot of areas that were starting to become subdivided around 1910 have completely filled in, and then areas that weren't even subdivided in 1910 filled in with mostly residential structures, but then commercial along the strip of St. Clair. The St. Clair streetcar line opened in August 1913 from Yonge Street to Caledonia Road as the second of 5 municipally owned streetcar lines known as the Toronto Civic Railways. The city built and operated these lines with the hope that to continue and promote further development along the newly annexed areas, along the urban fringe, and to meet demands from residents in these areas for better service. Now, soon after deciding to build a streetcar line on St. Clair in 1910, the city widened the avenue beyond the standard 66-foot street width typical of Toronto streets at the time, and before this decision, St. Clair was only 66 feet wide. Since St. Clair was one of the city's few crosstown streets, the city chose to widen the built-up area between Yonge and Avenue to 86 feet, and the rest of the avenue west to the Grand Trunk Railroad tracks at Caledonia to 100 feet. Now, as part of this work, the city created a 33-foot central boulevard in the middle for streetcar tracks. The boulevard featured a gravel bed with 2 inches of crushed stone around the rails. And historic photographs, such as this one at the city archives, show that the boulevard consisted of a grassy section in many spots and an elevated paved section for transit users waiting or embarking from a streetcar. Now, I haven't found much archival evidence to indicate the specific motivation behind the boulevard on St. Clair. A retrospective on the boulevard in the TTC's employee magazine 1928 noted that it was installed to, quote, present a very handsome appearance, unquote. In particular, they noted the trolley poles being located in the middle of the boulevard rather than the strewn wires that were usually associated with streetcars in Toronto. As well, the boulevard and the ballast around it acted to buffer the noise of streetcars, especially in a developing area like Forest Hill. And surprisingly, there was little mention of operational efficiencies in terms of the motivation of the right-of-way. And this might hint at the fact that the car wasn't as common of a vehicle in the early 1910s, but this really does strike me as interesting that nowhere in my research have I discovered discussion about, well, you know, the right-of-way will increase the operational efficiency or ease of streetcars, which is definitely a part of the argument today. Here we see a photo of the boulevard from the 1920s. Now note, if you can, I'll probably want to point them out, the pedestrians here, probably having just disembarked from the streetcar passing away, and that they're using the boulevard as essentially a safety mechanism to cross the street heading north. Now, despite this, pressure existed to remove the boulevard from the very beginning, if we are to believe a recollection of Bill Carter, who was a resident in the area who in 1938 in a local newspaper recalled how, quote, we fought against building a central boulevard, and it had to be removed in later years at tremendous expense. Pressure from city aldermen grew as soon as the TTC was formed in 1921 to remove the boulevard. A year later, 1922, a report from, here he is, R.C. Harris, the Works Commissioner, he suggested paving over the streetcar center boulevard, of course keeping the streetcar tracks, from Oakwood to the western end of the line. But the Committee on Works, the councillors and the controllers who sat on City Council, recommended to postpone the issue. In 1927, the TTC's general manager reflected that the source of the boulevard removal idea was brought about by the conditions created by parked motor cars. Let's see if you can see on this issue. This image shows it here, where this is in the 1920s. Automobiles had started to become prominent in the city, and similar to St. Clair today, cars parked on that first lane closest to the curb, and so essentially cars really only had one lane to move. The TTC didn't think it should have to cover the reconstruction track costs if the boulevard was removed, and this was pegged at around, the total project was pegged at around a little under $1 million, so that St. Clair might be, quote, used for garaging purposes by a relatively few number of motorists, who represented, the TTC argued, only 1/4 of people using the street. So why should we remove the boulevard? Only 1/4 of the people using the street are driving. Why should we not provide benefits to the other users? Now, almost every year in the 1920s, city aldermen urged the Board of Control or the Works Committee to look over the issue of removing the boulevard. And to get a sense of the motivation behind this, one alderman argued for the boulevard removal to, quote, enhance the safety of vehicular traffic, not pedestrians, not transit users. And interestingly, the councillors usually urging this did have representation along St. Clair, although at that time the wards were very north-south aligned, and so they also represented a lot of other interests in the city as well. In response, the TTC complained throughout the 1920s that the Boulevard decision would be unwise. But the Commission mostly emphasized the unfair nature of making the TTC, and thus transit users, as the TTC was self-sustaining at the time financially, to pay for a project that would disadvantage its users while benefiting auto drivers, especially when it comes to having to basically put new tracks in. And there was still life in the tracks. They thought it was an economic waste to install new tracks since there were still some years left in the tracks that had been laid originally in the early 1910s. So the decisive moment happens in 1928. The debate came to a head when City Council, with the TTC's, as I would call, hesitant acquiescence, decided to remove the first section of the Streetcar Boulevard from Bathurst to Dufferin. And again, I'm a bit surprised that the TTC didn't put up more of a fight about this, especially since it had emphasized that the St. Clair streetcar moved slightly faster than the comparable Danforth line because it had a right-of-way. It was also safer for transit users with 25 to 35% less accidents. It seems the TTC tried to stall the boulevard removal as long as possible, but they saw the writing on the wall politically. And the TTC ultimately agreed to bear the cost of reconstructing the streetcar tracks with a rebate provided by the city for paving the street itself. In any case, from 1928 to 1935, the boulevard was gradually paved over in 4 sections: Bathurst to Dufferin, Dufferin to Lansdowne, Lansdowne to Caledonia, and finally Bathurst to Yonge in 1935. But what's the larger context of this decision? And what does it say about thinking about pedestrian safety, automobility, and city building during this time in Toronto? A key factor, of course, was the clearly growing number and use of automobiles in Toronto. Now, one study in 1928, for example, noticed, and here it is right here, noticed more than 3 times the amount of cars coming in and out of the city in 1928 versus 1915 was the other comparator. Important to understand, in this era, North American cities began to alter the built environment to deal with the growing pressures of the automobile. Of note, this was the era before the massive urban expressway building that would mark the post-war years in the US and in some degree in Canada. And as historian Christopher Wells has argued in his great new recent book, Car Country, it was the interwar years that saw many small, almost unnoticeable changes to the built environment and landscape that transformed cities into a place for the car. And to reference Steve Penfold again in a great presentation he gave a couple of weeks ago, he made the similar argument when it came to Metro Toronto in the post-war years, that it was these road widenings and connections of arterial roads that actually transformed the landscape in Toronto to be more of a place for cars than even expressway building that did happen. And probably the best example of how minor changes came together to create bigger transformations in interwar Toronto was the rise of road widening and road connecting projects, and also, of course, parking. And this is where I think the boulevard removal on St. Clair is interesting. Rather than dramatic plans that never came to be in Toronto, the removal stands as a relatively modest change in the redefinition of the street as a place for cars. The boulevard removal was essentially a road widening for automobiles at the hands of other users of the street, transit users and pedestrians. By getting rid of the right-of-way, automobile drivers gained another lane each way. One city council decided to remove the boulevard in September 1928. A hubbub, to use the Globe's words, developed a few weeks later within council about the exact nature of what should replace the boulevard. The debate focused on whether to include safety islands or safety zones for transit users waiting for or exiting the streetcar. Mayor Sam McBride emerged as the biggest advocate for safety islands. He argued that motorists on other streets with streetcars sometimes hit people who had just disembarked from streetcars, and these safety islands would help minimize this on St. Clair. The others, or anti-zonists as they were called, noted that safety islands would essentially defeat much of the purpose of removing the boulevard, that is, the movement of cars. And on this side was, again, vocalized by R.C. Harris and politically very strongly by Comptroller Bert Wemp. As the Globe noted in its editorial, the issue revolved around whether pedestrians had, as they worded it, rights and were entitled to protection from cars. According to a survey from the Toronto Star, itself falling in the zonist camp, the call was almost unanimous for residents along St. Clair for the safety islands, citing pedestrian safety. One respondent noted that the safety islands offered, quote, protection for women and children against irresponsible types of motorists who act first and think afterwards. So City Council ultimately decided to erect the safety islands. You see them in the image here, along with traffic lights at major intersections at St. Clair to help regulate pedestrians and, of course, automobiles. The safety islands, you see in this image here, also from the archives, featured light poles with 4 different blinking lights, basically so that cars didn't crash into the islands, especially at night. It's hard to know how the boulevard removal affected streetcar service on St. Clair or pedestrian safety. But as soon as the safety islands were removed, the boulevard was removed and the safety islands were installed, the Globe noted that many motorists, quote, regard the safety zone lights as signs on a speedway. In less than 40 years after the removal of the boulevard, in 1974, the TTC actually painted these yellow lines here in an attempt to sort of cajole motorists to not use the right-of-way, even though they could. But it's ultimately proved unsuccessful. Now, more recently, and following the footsteps of right-of-way installations on Spadina and the Harbourfront streetcar lines in Toronto, a new right-of-way was built along St. Clair. And despite opposition, and in contrast to the boulevard removal decision in the 1920s, I think that the new right-of-way installation represents a shift away, in some degree, from the automobile-centric infrastructure thinking that we see developing in my presentation in the 1920s. And instead, it gives greater priority to transit and pedestrians. A study just published yesterday in the Toronto Star, timely for us, noted that almost a 50% drop in pedestrian accidents on St. Clair since the installation of the new right-of-way. That doesn't sound like a disaster to me. But I'll leave this more recent story to Councillor Mihevik. Thank you.